A single sheet of medieval crown glass held more value than an entire farm. This brilliant, almost magical material transformed sunlight into something sacred, illuminating the grand cathedrals and castles of the Middle Ages. By the end of this story, you will understand the incredible secret process that turned simple sand into windows of light. We will uncover how a secretive brotherhood of artisans mastered fire and motion, guarding techniques so closely that a single mistake could shatter everything. What does it take to spin a bubble of molten glass into a perfect, glowing disk? What forgotten skills were required to give us these rippled panes of ancient light? How much would you sacrifice to protect a secret that could build a cathedral? Behind the radiant windows stood a class of artisans as rare and valuable as the glass they created. These were not simple craftsmen, but members of powerful, secretive guilds that wielded immense influence across Europe. To join a glassmaking guild was to enter a closed world, a fraternity bound by sacred oaths and strict rules. Their workshops were fortresses of knowledge, and the techniques for creating crown glass were guarded as closely as any royal treasure. This was not a trade one could simply learn by observation. The secrets of the furnace, the precise mixtures of sand and ash, and the exact movements for gathering the molten glass were all passed down from master to apprentice, often within the same family for generations. Your name and your reputation were your entire inheritance, a legacy built on skill and silence. Can you picture a father teaching his son the exact moment to blow the glass, a moment that could not be written down but only felt? This created an impenetrable aura of mystery around their craft. They were the keepers of a near-magical process, the only ones who knew how to command fire and breath to spin a window into existence. Their social standing was unique, caught between the manual labor of a common craftsman and the revered knowledge of an alchemist. They answered to kings and bishops, for their work built the very symbols of power and faith, yet they lived by their own strict codes, protecting the luminous secret at the heart of their art. Their luminous art began not with fire, but with earth. Before a single furnace was lit, the glassmaker embarked on a quest for the perfect ingredients, a search as vital as the recipe itself. The first and most important was silica sand, but not just any sand from the riverbank. They needed a source of exceptional purity, fine-grained and pale. The slightest trace of iron, a common impurity, would stain the final glass a dull, muddy green, robbing it of that prized, crystal-clear quality. So these artisans became geologists of a sort, seeking out specific deposits, sometimes from great distances, that held the secret to true clarity. The second key ingredient was potash, a white, powdery substance created by burning certain hardwoods, most often beech or oak. This potash acted as a flux, dramatically lowering the impossibly high melting temperature of the sand. Think of it as a magical key that unlocked the stone, allowing it to flow like liquid. The final, crucial component was lime, typically added unintentionally through impurities in the sand or the ash. This was the stabilizing agent, the hidden guardian that prevented the finished glass from dissolving or corroding when exposed to water or the elements over centuries. The exact ratio of these three components was the workshop's soul, a formula guarded more fiercely than gold. A master might use 5 parts of his special sand to 1 part of his unique potash, a balance achieved through generations of trial and error. One family's secret mixture could produce a glass with a subtle blue tint, while another's yielded a faintly golden hue. This was the alchemist's kitchen, and a single misstep in sourcing, a single batch of iron-tainted sand or weak potash, could doom an entire week's labor before the fire was even lit, turning a potential masterpiece into a worthless, cloudy slab. The quality of the light began with the purity of the earth. Once the raw materials were gathered, the true secret began. No written instructions existed for the glassmaker's recipe, only a living knowledge passed from hand to hand. This formula was known as the batch, a precise and almost sacred mixture of sand and potash. The master would measure by eye and by feel, using wooden scoops and bowls whose sizes were unique to his workshop. He knew that a single handful too much of potash could make the glass unstable, while too little would leave it stubbornly unmelted. This was not a science of written numbers, but an art of intuition and memory, a dance of proportions held entirely in the mind. To an outsider, it looked like a cook adding pinches of spice to a stew, but the stakes were infinitely higher. Then came the magic of color. By introducing tiny amounts of minerals or metal oxides into this clear batch, the glassmaker could conjure an entire spectrum from the fire. A sprinkle of cobalt oxide, a rare and expensive powder, would produce a deep, heavenly blue. Copper filings could yield a vibrant emerald green, while flecks of gold, ground impossibly fine, created a stunning ruby red. Imagine watching a craftsman toss a pinch of what looked like ordinary dirt into a cloudy mixture, only to see it emerge from the furnace as a sheet of brilliant crimson glass. This transformation must have seemed like pure alchemy, a form of wizardry that turned base materials into jewels of light. The recipes for these colors were the most closely guarded secrets of all, often known only to the master himself. He was not just a craftsman, but a keeper of chromatic mysteries, capable of trapping the very essence of a sapphire or an emerald within a sheet of glass. But that carefully guarded batch of ingredients was useless without its beating heart, the glass furnace itself. This was not a simple fire, but a massive, multi-chambered beast of brick and clay, a masterpiece of medieval engineering built for a single, precise purpose. Its construction was a ritual, with each layer of fire-resistant stone and every air channel designed to tame the inferno within. The main chamber, or melting hearth, was where the magic happened. Here, the sand and potash mixture would be loaded into large, clay pots called crucibles, which were then placed directly into the roaring heat. But the furnace needed more than just raw fire, it needed control. A second chamber, often a domed annealing oven, sat connected to the main fire. This cooler space was where the finished glass pieces would be moved to slowly cool down over many hours, sometimes even days. If glass cools too quickly, the stress makes it shatter into 1,000 pieces. The annealing oven was the cradle that protected the newborn glass from its own fragility. Maintaining the exact temperature was an art form. The master glassmaker judged the heat by the color of the flames and the glow of the interior bricks. He knew that a cherry red was not enough for melting. He needed a searing, brilliant white, a heat so intense it could warp the very air. Stoking the fire was a delicate dance, adding just the right amount of wood or charcoal at just the right moments to keep the temperature perfectly steady for hours on end. There were no thermometers, no digital readouts, only centuries of accumulated instinct. The fate of that precious, glowing gather of glass, a craftsman's entire day's work, depended entirely on the stability of this brick and fire monster he had built with his own hands. One miscalculation, one draft of cold air, and the entire endeavor would be lost. The furnace was the true master of the workshop, and the glassmaker was the one who had learned to speak its language. With the furnace roaring at a carefully moderated heat, the first transformation began. This was the fritting stage, a crucial preliminary dance with the fire. The master would not simply throw his precious batch into the full inferno. Instead, he placed the mixture of sand and potash into a cooler section of the furnace, or sometimes into a separate, smaller oven altogether. Here, the temperature was raised just enough to partially melt the ingredients, but not to fully liquefy them. You would see the powdery mix begin to fuse, bubbling and frothing as trapped gases and moisture were violently driven off. This process prevented a catastrophe later on. If the raw batch was placed directly into the full heat of the main furnace, the rapid expansion of these gases would cause the entire crucible to boil over violently, spewing molten glass and ruining the mixture. After hours of this controlled heating, what remained was not glass, but a new substance called frit. It looked like coarse, lumpy gravel or a clinker of porous, crystalline material. The master would then remove this frit, let it cool, and break it into small, manageable pieces. Why go through this extra step? Fritting created a material that was already chemically unified. The sand and flux were now intimately bonded, ready to melt into a perfectly homogeneous liquid in the main furnace, free from the bubbles and imperfections that would otherwise plague the final glass. This was the unsung hero of the entire process, the patient, methodical step that ensured the clarity and strength of the radiant disk to come. Without this first, careful fire, the second, more dramatic one would only lead to failure. Once the frit was prepared, It was poured into the heart of the inferno. The main furnace chamber housed thick-walled clay pots known as crucibles, which glowed with an unearthly white heat. Inside these vessels, the granulated frit began its final metamorphosis, slowly dissolving into a shimmering, syrupy liquid. This was the birth of the glass itself, a radiant pool of pure potential. The master and his team could not afford to look away for long. They constantly monitored the molten soup, watching for the telltale signs of perfection. They needed the glass to become utterly homogeneous, with no streaks of unmixed material, and, most critically, no tiny trapped air bubbles. A single bubble would create a flaw in the final disc, a weak point that could shatter under stress or distort the precious light passing through. To achieve this flawless state, they would sometimes skim the surface with a special tool, lifting off a scum of impurities. They also relied on time and sustained, ferocious heat, allowing the molten glass to cook until it settled into a still, calm, and perfectly clear meniscus. Judging the exact moment it was ready required an eye trained by a lifetime of experience. It was not a clock they watched, but the liquid itself, waiting for it to achieve a specific, sluggish viscosity. This glowing pool was the lifeblood of their craft, and its quality determined everything that followed. One moment of inattention, one fluctuation in the furnace, and this liquid treasure could be ruined, turning a week's labor into nothing more than a pot of worthless, cloudy slag. The entire workshop held its breath, waiting for the master's nod that the glass was finally ready for its transformation. That glowing pool of liquid glass was now ready for its first breath. The master would approach the furnace, wielding his most important tool, the blowpipe. This was not a delicate instrument, but a long, hollow iron tube, thick enough to withstand the blistering heat. He would carefully rotate the tip of this pipe in the molten glass, skillfully gathering a small, glowing mass onto its end. This initial lump was called the gather, a blob of incandescent potential that held the future of the entire window within its fiery core. With a quick, practiced motion, he would roll the gather on a flat, polished slab of stone known as a marver. This cooled the outer surface just enough to create a smooth, even skin, while the interior remained a searing liquid. Now came the magic. The glassmaker would put the other end of the iron pipe to his lips and blow. A gentle, steady breath traveled down the length of the tube and into the heart of the molten gather. It was a moment of pure creation as the heavy, lumpy blob of glass began to swell from within, transforming into a delicate, glowing bubble. He was not just blowing air, he was breathing life into the material, shaping it with the same force that gives us our own voice. Can you feel the intense focus required? One puff too strong, and the bubble would burst, splattering molten glass everywhere. One breath too weak, and the form would remain a thick, useless mass. The glassmaker had to feel the resistance of the liquid glass through the iron in his hands, judging its temperature and thickness by its behavior as it spun. This was the true beginning of the craft, the moment a lump of melted sand was elevated into a vessel of light, all through the simple, yet profound, power of human breath. That first breath was only the beginning. The glassmaker now held a fragile, glowing bubble at the end of his iron rod, a sphere of liquid light that threatened to sag or tear at any moment. His true skill was revealed in the dance that followed, a continuous, hypnotic rotation of the pipe. He never stopped turning it, keeping the bubble spinning with a steady, rhythmic motion of his wrists and arms. This constant rotation was the only thing fighting gravity's pull, keeping the molten glass from drooping into a lopsided, useless blob. It was a test of endurance as much as artistry, demanding immense physical strength to hold the heavy iron pipe steady while maintaining that perfect, even spin. Imagine the strain in his shoulders and forearms, the intense focus required to keep the motion smooth for minutes on end. Any hesitation, any stutter in the spin, would be instantly frozen into the final form, creating a thick, uneven pane that would distort the light. He was not just shaping glass, he was spinning symmetry itself, using fire and motion to coax a perfect form from chaos. This was the heart of the mystery, a skill that could not be rushed or faked. It was a rhythm passed down through generations, the secret beat that turned a breath into a masterpiece. This glowing bubble, now known as a parison, was a vessel of liquid geometry. The glassmaker's work was far from over, as the initial sphere was merely the canvas for his next act of manipulation. Holding the heavy iron pipe, he would begin a new, more dynamic dance. Sometimes he would roll the parison back and forth along the marver, the flat stone slab cooling and stretching the glass into a more elongated, cylindrical form. Other times, with a powerful and confident motion, he would swing the entire pipe back and forth like a pendulum, letting gravity itself become his primary tool. You can almost feel the strain in his arms as he harnessed this invisible force, the molten glass stretching and thinning with every controlled arc. This was not brute force, but a profound collaboration with nature. He was guiding the flow, not fighting it, using the pull of the earth to achieve a shape that human hands alone could never create. He might also use simple wooden paddles or blocks, wetted to prevent them from burning, to gently pat and shape the soft glass, flattening a side or defining a curve. Each movement was deliberate, each decision made in a split second based on the glass temperature and viscosity. He was reading the material like a living thing, feeling its resistance and its willingness to be shaped. This careful, rhythmic manipulation was all in preparation for the final, most dramatic act, a transformation that would turn this elongated parison from a vessel into a radiant disk of captured light. Then came the most delicate handoff in the entire process. As the elongated parison glowed, an assistant approached with a second tool, a solid iron rod known as the pontal. With immense care, the master glassmaker touched the hot tip of this pontal rod to the very bottom of the suspended glass form. He sealed it on, creating a new anchor point. This simple act transferred the entire weight of the molten piece from the hollow blowpipe to this solid iron spine. The workshop fell silent for a crucial moment. The master then gave the original blowpipe a sharp, precise tap right where it met the glass. With a distinct crack, the iron tube broke free and was pulled away. What remained was the parison, now held aloft only by the pontal rod, and with a small, open hole at its top where the blowpipe had been. That opening was not a flaw, it was the gateway to the crown. All the previous effort, the gathering and blowing and swinging, had led to this single, exposed aperture. The glass was no longer a closed vessel, but an open-ended cylinder of potential, ready for its final, breathtaking unfurling. The entire fate of the disc now hung from that single iron rod, its molten lip gaping, waiting for the command to become something entirely new. With the parison fixed to the pontal rod, the true miracle of centrifugal force was about to unfold. The glassmaker would carefully reheat the entire piece in the mouth of the furnace, bringing it back to a state of perfect, glowing plasticity. The moment it reached the right temperature, he would step back from the heat and, with a powerful, explosive motion, begin to spin the heavy iron rod. He did not just turn it, he whipped it into a rapid, dizzying rotation. This was the climax of the entire ritual, a breathtaking act of physics and faith. Centrifugal force, that same power that pulls you outward on a spinning carousel, immediately took hold of the soft glass. The small opening at the top of the parison began to stretch, the walls of the cylinder flying outward, flaring into an ever-expanding disk. From a closed vessel, it transformed in mere seconds into a wide, shimmering circle of liquid light, spinning so fast it became a radiant, golden halo in the dim workshop. The skill here was almost superhuman. The glassmaker had to feel the perfect speed through the vibrations in the iron rod, spin too slowly, and the disc would remain small and thick, a failed, lumpy plate. Spin too fast, or with an uneven rhythm, and the fragile, thinning glass would simply fly apart, exploding into a shower of molten droplets. His entire body became an instrument of balance, his arms and wrists working to maintain a perfectly smooth rotation that distributed the glass into a sheet of astonishingly uniform thinness. He was not just making a window, he was commanding a miniature universe, spinning a solar system of glass into a perfect, flat plane. To witness this was to see a master defy gravity itself, using pure motion to spin a bubble into a brilliant, rippled disk of captured sunlight. That radiant, spinning disk was a masterpiece of tension, a frozen moment of immense internal stress. The moment it stopped spinning, its fate was far from sealed. The glassmaker, his muscles aching from the effort, now faced his most patient task. Using the pontil rod, he carefully carried the huge, still glowing circle, a giant flat bubble, away from the spinning area and toward a special, cooler chamber of the furnace known as the annealing oven, or layer. This was not a place of fire, but a sanctuary of controlled cooling. He would lay the disc on a bed of warm sand or a ceramic shelf, then seal the chamber. Inside, the temperature was meticulously lowered, not over minutes, but over many long hours, sometimes even an entire day. This gradual process was the unsung hero of glassmaking. If the hot glass was exposed to the cool air of the workshop, the outer surface would contract and harden almost instantly, while the inner core remained hot and expanded. This conflict of forces, called thermal shock, would tear the material apart, creating an explosive chorus of cracks and reducing the beautiful disc to a pile of glittering shards. The annealing oven acted as a cradle, allowing the entire mass of glass to cool in perfect unison, molecule by molecule, releasing those deadly internal stresses. The glassmaker was not just cooling his creation, he was teaching it how to be solid, guiding it gently from a state of fiery chaos to one of stable, enduring strength. Every pane of glass that survived the centuries did so because of this quiet, patient vigil over the cooling fire. The silence of the cooling oven finally breaks as the master glassmaker opens the heavy door. He reaches inside and carefully lifts the cooled disc, its fiery glow now replaced by a steady, crystalline clarity. This is the moment of judgment. He holds up the large, circular sheet to the light, his eyes scanning its surface like a jeweler examining a rare gem. The glass is not uniformly flat. At its very center is a thick, rounded lump, the unmistakable scar of its creation. This is the bullion, also called the crown, the point where the pontil rod was attached. It is a dense, opaque knot, a frozen remnant of the intense heat and iron that once held the entire disc aloft during its spinning birth. This central boss is far too thick and distorted for a window, but it is an inseparable part of the piece, the anchor point of the entire process. His fingers trace the ripples that flow outward from this center, concentric waves frozen in the glass, a permanent record of the centrifugal force that shaped it. He is looking for the story the glass tells. A single tiny bubble, trapped during the melting, would appear as a flaw, a speck that would catch the light and distort the view. A streak of unmixed material would create a cloudy veil, ruining the prized transparency. The presence of a hairline crack, perhaps from a moment of stress during cooling, would mean the entire disc was a failure. He holds it at different angles, watching how the light passes through, searching for that perfect, even diffusion that marks a masterpiece. The value of this single sheet, a week's labor of fire and breath, is determined in these quiet minutes of inspection. A flawless piece, clear and strong, could command a price that would support his workshop for months. A piece with even a minor imperfection might be cut down for a smaller, less important window, its value diminished. He is not just looking at glass, he is reading the entire history of its making, from the purity of the sand to the steadiness of his own hand, all captured in this one, luminous circle. Held up to the light, the magnificent crown sheet was a map of its own creation, but it was never destined to remain a single, perfect circle. Its journey into a window began with the patient, nerve-wracking art of the glass cutter. Armed with a simple but deadly sharp diamond point or a hardened steel wheel, this specialist would approach the disc not as a fragile object, but as a geometric puzzle. His first task was to carefully score the surface, drawing his tool in a perfectly straight line from the outer edge inward, directly toward the thick, unusable bullion at the center. He did not cut all the way through the material. Instead, he used precise pressure to create a single, controlled fracture line, a microscopic fault that would guide the coming break. The sound was a faint, high-pitched screech, a whisper of stress being written into the glass. He would score multiple lines this way, dividing the circular sheet into long, curved trapezoids, like slicing a pie. But how did he turn these scored lines into clean breaks? He had a secret tool for this, a technique as simple as it was terrifying. He would place a thick, soft rope soaked in water along the underside of the score line. The sudden, localized cooling on just one side of the glass caused it to contract minutely, and with an audible pop, the stress would do its work. The pane would cleave perfectly along the scored path, a clean, straight break that seemed to happen by magic. One wrong move, one uneven score, or a slip of the hand, and the entire sheet could shatter unpredictably, destroying weeks of work in an instant. The value now shifted from the whole disc to these smaller, manageable pieces. The long, curved panes cut from the outer portions of the disc were the most prized. They were the thinnest and clearest, possessing the fewest ripples and the best optical quality, destined for the most prominent windows in a cathedral's nave. The thick, distorted bullion at the very center, the crown itself, was almost always cut away and discarded, or at best, used for a small, high-up window where its poor clarity would not be noticed. These smaller, often diamond-shaped panes were then fitted into the intricate lead cames of a window frame, each piece a fragment of that original, spinning sun, now locked into a mosaic of light and color, telling a story not just of faith, but of fire, motion, and a cutter's steady hand. These fragmented panes of light held a secret in their very structure. Look closely at a window made from crown glass, and you will see it is never perfectly flat. The centrifugal force of its spinning, birth left behind a permanent memory in the form of subtle, concentric ripples, like a stone dropped into a still pond. The entire sheet also possesses a gentle, almost imperceptible curvature, a ghost of its original form as a vast, open disc. These are not flaws, but the authentic signature of the hand and the process. When sunlight streams through such a window, it does not pass through with sterile, modern clarity. Instead, the light bends and warps ever so slightly as it moves through these varying thicknesses and curves. The world outside becomes a living painting, a view that shimmers and dances. A straight tree line might appear to waver gently, and the figures of people passing by are softened, their edges blurred into something almost dreamlike. This distinctive, slightly distorted quality is the soul of historic buildings. It is the reason a medieval cathedral feels alive with a unique, organic light, a light that cannot be replicated by any perfectly uniform, machine-made glass. That gentle distortion is not a failure of technology, but a testament to a human touch, a permanent record of fire, breath, and spin captured for centuries. Yet for all its brilliance, crown glass was not the only path to a window. Its great rival was a method known as the broad glass or muff technique, a process that created an entirely different kind of pane. While the crown glassmaker spun a single, radiant disc, the broad glassmaker began by blowing a much longer and larger cylinder of glass, a hollow tube called a muff. This cylinder was then carefully cut lengthwise with a hot iron while it was still soft and pliable. The craftsman would then open this split cylinder like a book, laying it flat on a hot, smooth surface inside a special oven called a flattening kiln. There, under gentle heat, the curved glass would slowly relax and settle into a large, rectangular sheet. The resulting glass had its own distinct personality. It lacked the central bullion and the dramatic ripples of crown glass, offering a larger, flatter surface area. But this process left its own marks. The glass often retained faint lines and a subtle texture from the flattening process, and it was rarely as optically pure as the finest outer portions of a crown disc. Its great advantage was size. A single broad sheet could yield a much larger single pane than the curved segments cut from a crown, making it ideal for the bigger windows that became fashionable in later centuries. So the choice was between the crown's brilliant clarity and the broad sheet's practical scale, a decision that shaped the very light and character of the buildings they filled. That shimmering disc, a week's labor of fire and motion, carried a price tag that reflected its arduous birth. The sheer cost of crown glass was woven from every stage of its creation, starting with the materials themselves. Sourcing the purest silica sand often meant transporting it from distant, secret locations, a costly endeavor of carts and barges. The potash required was no simple ash. It came from burning enormous quantities of specific hardwoods, consuming forests to fuel the clarity of a single pane. Then came the furnace, a ravenous beast that devoured tons of expensive charcoal over days just to maintain its perfect, white-hot temperature. But the greatest cost was human. A master glassmaker commanded a salary comparable to a skilled architect or a university scholar. His team of assistants, each specializing in a single step from gathering to annealing, represented years of trained labor. A single flawed breath during blowing, one uneven spin, or a minute too long in the annealing oven could shatter this entire investment into worthless fragments. This immense risk was baked directly into the price. The final limitation was size itself. A crown glass disc could only be as large as a man's strength, and the limits of centrifugal force would allow, typically no more than 4 or 5 feet across. From this circle, only the outer, clearest portions were prized for large windows, while the thick, distorted center was often waste. You were not just paying for glass, you were paying for the immense skill, the consumed resources, and the high probability of failure inherent in spinning light from sand. This made crown glass a powerful declaration of wealth and piety. For a nobleman to install such windows in his manor house was to announce his access to rare artisans and immense capital. For the church, these windows were more than decoration, they were a theological statement. The financial sacrifice required to fill a cathedral with this divine, rippling light was seen as an act of devotion, a literal offering to God written in the most expensive material the medieval world could produce. To look through a crown glass window was to see the world through a filter of pure luxury, a luxury measured in fire, sweat, and gold. Each pane of cut glass was a promise of light, waiting for the glazier to give it a permanent home. This artisan worked not with fire, but with lead and a steady hand, assembling the fractured pieces into a unified whole. His primary material was the cane, an H-shaped strip of lead that acted as both frame and glue. He would lay out the intricate design of the window, a full-scale cartoon drawn on a large wooden table, and begin selecting the cut panes of crown glass. Each piece was a unique, slightly curved fragment, and he had to fit them together like an infinitely delicate jigsaw puzzle. The lead cames were grooved on 2 sides. He would carefully press the edge of a glass pane into one groove of a long lead strip, then take another pane and slot it into the opposite groove, effectively clasping both pieces of glass within a single, flexible spine of metal. Can you feel the patience required? A pane that was cut a fraction too large would not fit, threatening to crack its neighbor under pressure. A piece that was too small would leave a gap, a flaw that would let in the wind and rain. The glazier's bench was a mosaic in progress, a growing tapestry of light and dark lead lines slowly covering the drawn design beneath. This was the birth of the iconic leaded light window, where the strength of metal and the fragility of glass became interdependent. With all the glass pieces nestled within their lead cames, the window was a fragile web, held together by friction alone. The next step was to make it permanent and strong. The glazier used a different kind of fire now, the precise, localized flame of a soldering iron. At every single point where the lead strips crossed, he had to create a solid bond. He would touch the hot iron to a tiny block of a tin and lead alloy, melting a small droplet onto each joint. The skill was in the speed and the amount. Too much heat would melt the underlying lead came, warping the entire section. Too little, and the joint would be weak, threatening to unravel the entire panel when it was lifted. Each of these hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldered joints, was a tiny pledge of structural integrity. Once cooled, the panel transformed from a collection of pieces into a single, rigid entity. It could now be carefully lifted from the table, a heavy, flexible sheet of glass and metal, but it was not yet ready to face the elements. The final, crucial act of weatherproofing remained. The glazier would take a special, putty-like cement and work it into the narrow gap between the glass and the lead on both sides of the panel, using a small brush to force it deep. This cement sealed the microscopic gaps, locking out moisture and wind, and adding further strength to the entire assembly. Only then, after this patient layering of skill upon skill, was the window complete. It was no longer just a collection of panes, but a resilient shield of stories and light, ready to be set into the stone of a cathedral and survive the centuries. That final, resilient shield of stories and light was not just a barrier against the world, but a gateway to the divine. This marriage of crown glass and stained glass art was a collaboration of fire and faith, where the very imperfections of the glass elevated the color to something celestial. The secret lay in the gentle, unavoidable ripples and curves of the spun crown glass pane. When a master glass painter applied his metallic oxide pigments to create a saint's robe or a heavenly scene, He was painting onto a surface that was never perfectly flat. This was not a flaw, but a feature. As sunlight streamed through the finished window, it did not strike the colored pigments and reflect back in a single, harsh beam. Instead, the light entered the rippled glass and was broken up, scattered and diffused in 1,000 tiny directions. Think of light passing through a compound versus light passing over the small, dancing waves of a stream. The crown glass was that stream, making the light alive and dynamic. This diffusion filled the colored pigments with a soft, internal luminescence, giving deep blues an oceanic depth, and ruby reds a glowing, heart-like warmth. The colors did not sit on the surface, they vibrated from within, merging and overlapping in a way that a flat pane could never achieve. This interaction created the famous ethereal glow of the medieval cathedral, a light that feels both ancient and alive. It was not a dark, somber space, but a realm of luminous color, a vision of heaven built from the happy accident of spun glass and its beautiful, rippled soul. A shattered piece of glass in the soil holds its entire history within its curves and chemistry. For an archaeologist, these humble fragments are not just broken trash, but priceless pages from a medieval storybook. The first and most obvious clue is the bullion, that thick, rounded lump at the center of the original disc. Even in a small shard, its presence is unmistakable. While the outer edges of a crown disc were spun thin and clear, the bullion remained dense, often full of tiny bubbles and impurities, a frozen record of the pontal rod's fiery kiss. Finding a piece with this characteristic texture and thickness is like finding a signature at the bottom of a painting. It confirms the object's origin beyond any doubt. But what if the fragment comes from the outer part of the disc, where the bullion is absent? Here, the detective work deepens. The glass will still possess a subtle, consistent curvature, a ghost of its spinning birth. An expert will carefully measure this curve, and if the arc corresponds to the radius of a known crown glass disc, the identification is almost certain. Then comes the final, scientific confirmation, the chemical fingerprint. Using precise tools, archaeologists can analyze the molecular makeup of the glass itself. Medieval crown glass has a very specific signature, a unique ratio of silica to potash to lime that differs from later, industrial recipes. They can even detect the trace minerals that point to the specific sand quarry or forest where the potash was made, tracing the fragment not just to a process, but sometimes to a specific region or even workshop. Each tiny shard is a puzzle piece. A curved piece with a bullion center tells the story of the spin. A clear, rippled piece from the edge speaks of centrifugal force and a master's steady hand. Together, these silent clues allow us to reassemble not just a broken window, but the very moments of its creation, pulling a single, luminous breath from the depths of the earth. This culture of secrecy was enforced by a rigid system of guilds, organizations that controlled every aspect of a glassmaker's life. To enter a guild was to surrender your independence for the promise of ultimate knowledge. A young boy, perhaps only 12 years old, would begin as an apprentice, a role that involved no glassmaking at all for years. His duties were those of a servant, sweeping the workshop floor, preparing the master's meals, and endlessly stoking the furnace to learn its moods. This period could last a decade, a test of patience and loyalty designed to weed out the unworthy. Only after proving his dedication might he be allowed to touch a blowpipe, first practicing with cold, useless materials. The path from apprentice to journeyman, and finally to master, was a slow and arduous climb, each step guarded by the existing masters who held the power to grant or deny advancement. The ultimate goal, the title of master, required creating a true masterpiece, a piece of crown glass of such flawless quality that it met the guild's exacting standards, all under the watchful eyes of men who had a vested interest in limiting the number of new masters. Why would they create more competition for themselves? This system ensured that knowledge trickled down at a glacial pace, and only to those who had been thoroughly vetted and indoctrinated into the guild's closed world. The penalties for breaking this code of silence were severe and designed to ruin a man completely. A craftsman caught sharing a secret formula or technique with an outsider could face massive fines, a sum so large it could bankrupt his family. For more serious offenses, he could be permanently expelled from the guild, a sentence that was essentially an economic death warrant. An excommunicated glassmaker could not practice his trade in any city with a guild presence, his hard-won skills rendered useless. In some regions, the punishment could even extend to physical mutilation, such as the severing of a hand, a brutal and permanent reminder of the value placed on their guarded knowledge. This was not merely about protecting a trade, it was about protecting a form of alchemy that bordered on the divine. The guilds were not just unions, they were fortresses, and the secret of spinning light from sand was the treasure they were built to defend for centuries. Yet for all its brilliance, crown glass was a technological dead end. The very qualities that made it so magical, its ripples and its central bullion, were also its greatest limitations. You simply could not make a truly large, flat window from a spinning disc. The process was trapped by human physiology, bound by the strength of a single man's arm and the physics of centrifugal force. A disc larger than 4 or 5 feet would become impossibly heavy to spin, and even if you could, it would likely tear itself apart. This inherent restriction meant that the grand architectural visions of the 18th and 19th centuries, with their enormous windows and glass-fronted shops, were completely out of reach for the crown glassmaker. His craft was a beautiful, intricate song, destined to be drowned out by the roar of the Industrial Revolution. The end came not from a failure of skill, but from a new invention that redefined the very idea of a window pane. In the early 19th century, a new method emerged, one that traded the poetic spin of the crown for the practical efficiency of the cylinder. This technique, known as the cylinder-blown sheet method, began much like its broad glass predecessor. A glassblower would create a massive, elongated cylinder of glass, sometimes as long as 6 feet. But the crucial innovation was a machine that could then cut this cylinder lengthwise while it was still hot, before transferring it to a special flattening kiln. Inside this kiln, the curved sheet would be reheated just enough to soften it, allowing its own weight to settle onto a perfectly flat, polished iron plate. The result was a revelation, a sheet of glass that was larger, flatter, and far more uniform than any crown disc could ever be. There were no ripples, no thick bullion to cut away and discard. This new process was also dramatically cheaper and faster. It required less skilled labor, as the art of the perfect spin was replaced by the mechanics of a controlled slump. A single team could produce vast quantities of clear, serviceable glass to feed the growing demands of a new, modern world. Almost overnight, the centuries-old craft of crown glassmaking became an expensive anachronism. Its beautiful imperfections, once a signature of human touch, were now seen as flaws in an age that prized perfect clarity and scale. The radiant, spinning disc, the product of a week's laborious fire and breath, was quietly superseded by the efficient, repeatable rectangle. The light in our buildings changed, becoming sharper and more direct, as the last echoes of the spinning crown faded into history. That ancient craft, declared a dead end, has found a new, vital purpose. In small workshops across Europe and beyond, the fires are being lit once more. This is not a tale of industrial revival, but of meticulous resurrection. A handful of dedicated artisans have painstakingly rediscovered the lost art of crown glassmaking, not to fill modern skyscrapers, but to heal the windows of history itself. When a medieval cathedral needs a repair, you cannot simply pop in a piece of factory-made float glass. The soul of the building resides in that specific, rippled light. A flat, perfect pane would be a lie, a jarring note in a centuries-old symphony. These specialist studios operate on a scale the old guilds would recognize. Their teams are small, their furnaces are built by hand, and their work is governed by the same slow, patient rhythm. An order might come in from a national trust or a cathedral workshop, a request for a single pane to replace one shattered by a storm or worn thin by time. The modern glassmaker begins the same ancient dance, gathering the molten glass, blowing the parison, and spinning it into that familiar, radiant disc. The goal is not perfection as we define it today, but authenticity. They aim to match the original glass in every detail, its specific hue, its unique pattern of ripples, even the tiny bubbles and impurities that give the old glass its character. This is the ultimate act of respect, using fire to preserve the past rather than erase it, Can you grasp the profound shift? The value of this glass is no longer measured in its novelty, but in its faithfulness to a forgotten standard. These artisans are not just craftsmen, they are historians working in fire and light, ensuring that when sunlight falls through a restored window, it continues to tell the same ancient, shimmering story. The fiery heart of the medieval furnace held more than just molten sand. It held a profound understanding of nature's hidden forces. This story of crown glass is a lasting testament to human ingenuity, a brilliant collaboration between fire, breath, and motion. It reminds us that behind every shimmering pane of ancient light, there was a master whose secret skills transformed the most common substance on Earth into something magical. These artisans did not simply make windows, they learned the language of light itself, coaxing it to dance and ripple through their hand-spun crystal. They turned a handful of earth into a substance of wonder and beauty, a material that defined the very soul of an age. The radiant mystery of how they did it, guarded for so long by oaths and fire, is finally unveiled. Their legacy is not just in the glass that survives, but in the enduring power of an idea, that with patience and skill, humanity can spin something perfect and luminous from the raw, rough materials of the world.